Welcome back. We're talking about the military and humanitarian crisis in Syria. Joining us now from Moscow is political analyst and commentator Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We have been talking about the crisis in Syria right now. The ceasefire that was brokered by Russia and the United States has broken apart, fallen apart, and we now have an aid convoy which has been bombed inside the country. The United States is blaming Russia for this, and the United Nations says that whomever is responsible for this bombing, it is a war crime. Has there been any response from Russia?
Well, in Russia, the spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, he said that there were certainly no orders from the Kremlin to bomb any convoys. It is not immediately clear who hit that convoy, and I think we will know it in some time. But in general, a lot of Russian officials, including the military, they point to the fact that just less than 2 days ago, the Americans hit the Syrian army, killed 62 Syrian soldiers, and did not even apologize for that. So that bombing of the convoy is coming at a very convenient time for Washington to sort of redirect the public attention from what is for certain a mistake, a grave mistake by the US Air Force, to something that is supposedly a mistake of the Russian or Syrian Air Force.
The Americans and the Russians have been trying for some time now to work together to resolve this crisis in Syria, but there now appears to be a very public split between Russia and the United States after the US bombed Syrian forces, that bombing that you just talked about over the weekend. The United States says it was unintentional, but let's take a listen to how this panned out at the United Nations.
As you know, we convened the consultations of the Security Council because the United States has bombed the Syrian armed forces in Deir ez-Zor. It is quite significant and frankly suspicious that the United States chose to conduct this particular airstrike at this time. Why would all of a sudden the United States choose to help the Syrian armed forces defending Deir ez-Zor? After all, they did nothing when ISIL was advancing on Palmyra.
If we determine that we did indeed strike Syrian military personnel, that was not our intention. This said, even by Russia's standards, tonight's stunt, a stunt replete with moralism and grandstanding, is uniquely cynical and hypocritical.
So we have the United States there describing it as a stunt. That's Russia is coming out with moralism and grandstanding, the bombing that you were talking about.
Well, I think that there are obviously two lines in the American leadership on the situation in Syria. When we talked to the head of the State Department, John Kerry, he speaks out in favor of a compromise. He even said several times that we never insisted on Mr. Assad leaving power. But then you have Pentagon and you have several hawks in the administration of President Obama who use a very different language. So I think the language that we have just heard from Samantha Power, it is the language of that part, you know, the militant part of the American administration. As you saw, she just acknowledged that the United States, maybe by mistake, but still killed 62 soldiers of a foreign sovereign state, and the United States did not have the decency to apologize for that. And after that, Samantha Power is calling the Russian criticism of that killing cynical and grandstanding. I think our viewers can judge for themselves who is immoral or moral in this situation.
Right, we have the ceasefire that's broken down right now. When Russia looks at the situation, what are the options that Moscow has right now?
Well, Moscow has been striving for just one goal, or maybe two goals. The first goal is to have peace in Syria, to stop the violence, without the terrorist state, the so-called Islamic State, having any territory under its control in Syria or in Iraq, because we have lived through a terrible aggression of international terrorism in Chechnya in the 90s, and a lot of aid for the terrorists there came from Saudi Arabia. We don't want that story repeated now from the so-called Islamic State in Syria or in Iraq. So this is goal number one. Goal number two is to prevent the legally elected Syrian government from being ousted. That doesn't mean that Russia insists on Mr. Assad staying in power. It can be someone else, but that person who will be the next president, he has to be chosen by the Syrian people and not by some kind of national Syrian coalition, national Syrian council, the groups that only the Western countries recognized, that the Western countries, primarily the United States, change like gloves. First it was National Syrian Council, then it was National Syrian Coalition, then it was Free Syrian Army. So these groups have no right to appoint the new president. It's only the Syrian people at elections who will have the right to replace Mr. Assad by someone else.
If there are going to be attempts that are going to be made to try and rescue this ceasefire right now, to try and get the aid convoys to start moving again, what kind of cooperation would there be between the United States and Russia? Is there a command center where both parties are making the decisions on what happens?
Well, Russia has been suggesting to set up this kind of command center for a long time, and during the last long meeting between Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry, if you remember, it was decided to set up a consultation center that would try to differentiate, to divide the legitimate opposition to Mr. Assad and the terrorist groups. If you remember, Russia was the main lobbyist of the Geneva I talks. You know, the Western countries did not believe in Geneva I. They didn't want these talks to happen. So basically, Russia is for a compromise with the United States. But with the United States, you have a mixed picture. You have, as I told you, Mr. Kerry, who sounds like a peacemaker, but also you have Samantha Power, you have Susan Rice, you have the Pentagon chief, Ashton Carter. They use a very different language, not only towards Syria, but also towards Russia. So it's not immediately clear who has the real power in Washington, who decides what the American line on Syria is going to be.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Dmitry Babich, thanks for joining us.